Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. Now, a report came out recently, revealed, I should say, by a NATO-linked organization, which spoke about European sites which host American nuclear weapons, one of them in Belgium and otherwise in Germany, Netherlands, and Turkey as well. This has created a bit of concern, of course, on the part of some of those countries, especially the opposition, though it's not really a secret that those sites hosted, or those countries, I should say, hosted these American nuclear weapons. It was just not known where exactly those weapons were stored. In Belgium specifically, the opposition has also called for a full and transparent, talk about this and conversation about this when it comes on the part of the government, considering the fact that Belgium itself has spoken about non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, etc. So as a whole, the Belgian opposition is calling out the hypocrisy of the Belgian government in this regard as well. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Guy Burton, who is an adjunct professor of international relations at Vesalius College in Brussels. He is joining us now, though, from the British capital, London. Guy, as always, thanks for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of the controversy about this? As I said in my introduction, it's not like everyone didn't know that there were American nuclear weapons in Europe to begin with.
Yes, and I think the reason why it's come out so recently and become such an issue in Belgium is partly because of the political situation there at the moment. At the end of May, we had the elections, and so currently there is a long process of government formation. So you can sort of perhaps see this debate and this discussion sort of feeding into the political conversation that's going on around sort of the development of a new cabinet there. So that's a domestic issue. I think also there's the international dimension as well. As you know, there's over the last few years, there's been, growing concern about Russian aggression within Europe, especially sort of after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So increasingly, Europe and NATO is becoming more concerned about the Russian presence there. And so that obviously raises questions about, the nuclear deterrence.
But then I wonder, Guy, on that you just made there, because obviously that would be the American/European argument about why these nuclear weapons are needed to be placed in those 6 U.S. and European bases. Do you not think that that's overkill, though, considering the fact that Russia is just one nation versus all these other nations?
Yes, and I would say that this is obviously how the Europeans have sort of portrayed it. Certainly, the report itself came out from the NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, and the report that you were actually citing at the very start made the point about Russia being a key concern. But it's not just about Russia. One of the other elements of the report that came out also included the fact that there's changes in terms of sort of the use of technology and cyber systems, which mean that the decision-making times on the use of weapons, is now much shorter. So, of course, that sort of plays into this question now. If you have nuclear weapons on your soil, are they going to be used? Do you have, sufficient input into making the decision about that?
Mm. But then it's interesting, isn't it, Guy, that then the final report that came out then removed references to those exact bases. Why reveal it, then take it back? Many people saying it was obviously a mistake, but does it really even matter in the grand scheme of things?
I think, as you made the point in your introductory remarks, it's not that there's been any, hidden secrets. Given there has been a number of nuclear weapons on European soil for a very long time, and obviously at least 2 of the nuclear states that we know are Britain and France, so part of the NATO alliance. I guess the concern is that you're looking at a number of states which are non-nuclear states that have nuclear weapons on their soil. So this does raise the question about sort of nuclear proliferation, stretching the notion of nuclear proliferation sort of beyond those who've agreed to sign up to preventing this from happening. But then I think we also need to sort of look, I guess, in the broader picture, because if we look at sort of the total numbers of nuclear weapons, at the end of the Cold War in the early part of the 1990s, there were over 20,000, and over the series of the last 30 years, we've seen a significant reduction down to around 5,000 around the world. yes, the number of nuclear states has increased, and most obviously, most recently, North Korea, and as well as India and Pakistan in the late 1990s. So yes, the number of nuclear states has increased, but the overall number of nuclear weapons has gone down. I don't mean to sound sanguine about this, but
yeah, I mean, on that point, Guy, because it just jumped out at me that obviously Donald really wants the U.S. nuclear arsenal to be upgraded, and he has, of course, put funds towards that. So will this trend of less nuclear weapons in total, that is, around the world, will that flip because the Americans essentially, it can be argued, have begun this new nuclear arms race?
Yeah, and I think also it's not just that the Americans involved in all of this. I think there's, the NATO has also suggested that Russia seems to be trying to enhance its capabilities, at least in terms of sort of developing sort of the launch facilities that would make the use of them more cohesive. So in a way, I guess there is a question of less about quantity and more about quality here. So yeah, I mean, I guess the numbers are going down. I guess we should be more concerned about sort of the quality of the resulting weapons. But then broadly, I mean, I guess the thing to talk about is whether the norms of nuclear weapons has really changed. Certainly when they were first created, at least the atomic weapon in 1945, it was seen as possible to be used in war, and it was done in Japan. But since then, there has been very much a norm not to use nuclear weapons. It's seen more as a sort of insofar as you can call a weapon defensive, a deterrence. I mean, certainly that's why I guess the Indians and Pakistanis developed theirs. And certainly if we look at North Korea as well, it's not just a tool of deterrence, it's also a form of, negotiation and getting to the table for talks. So
then,
I mean,
it's interesting that if I may come in, Guy, because, I was looking up on Belgium and its own track record when it comes to the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. It ratified the agreement for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons in 1968. And the argument goes that, listen, if the U.S. has its nuclear weapons based in our country, then we don't need to be spending on nuclear weapons ourselves or as much on defense as a whole. Then one wonders why then, for example, if I may just throw an example out there, why go after Iran then, if it were, as has been alleged, if it were actually pursuing nuclear weapons? What's the big deal then? If Iran were to say, as you said, we want a deterrence as well, what's wrong with that?
I think, well, in the case of Iran, I mean, the point about sort of the nuclear program in Iran, at least initially it was understood to be a civilian one to develop alternative sources of energy. I guess the concern here is the ability to transfer from civilian use to military use. So that is why we've had the nuclear deal and talks related to Iran. Certainly what we're seeing now at the moment, since the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran last year, we have seen Iran using threats to breach certain elements of the deal as a way of trying to get the Europeans on board and try to get the Americans back to the acceptance of the deal. So certainly, you can see the tool of nuclear weapons or a nuclear program is far broader than their actual use. It's for diplomacy in a way as well. But in the case that you asked about Belgium, you said you asked about whether does Belgium actually need to have a nuclear deterrence itself if it is part of NATO and therefore part of the nuclear umbrella that the United States provides. There's an interesting debate and discussion. A colleague of mine over at the VUB in Brussels, Alexander Matala, he recently wrote a piece, for Egmont, which is Belgium's International Relations Institute, in which he said, we need to have a debate about this. But one of the challenging things about this is that if Belgium takes itself out of the conversation, then it cannot be part of the final result, the final use and decision of where to place them or how to use them. And this has actually got a quite nice analogy, a non-nuclear analogy here in London where I now am, because we're talking about Britain leaving the EU. Well, if we leave the EU, we have freedom of action, but we become much weaker in the process as well.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave that as our final thought then, Guy, and that's a point to end off on. But of course, we appreciate your time and insight, of course, speaking to us there from the British capital this morning. Of course, this issue, viewers, is an important one. And according to even some defense experts, according to reports I was reading, this sort of leak, geographical leak, if it may be called that, may have even been intentional, a subtle message to near-peer enemies, Russia, obviously. But otherwise, it also then goes back to the fact that the U.S. has these nuclear weapons to begin with in Europe, close to Russia. And the Russians have always complained about NATO expansionism close to their borders. And that is why Russia then would need nuclear weapons placed on its borders as well. This back and forth, does this mean that there will be a new nuclear arms race? Because we know that the INF Treaty is essentially already dead. What does this mean going forward? Will there be a new treaty? Will there be some control placed on these nuclear arms that seem to be growing in prevalence? As Guy said, it's not necessarily a question of how many nuclear weapons there are, but the quality of them and the kind of damage that they can possibly inflict if they were ever, God forbid, to be used. We'll be back after a break with my next segment. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the U.S., which has announced sanctions on Myanmar's military commander-in-chief and 3 other military leaders. All of this because of what it has said was their role in, quote-unquote, the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya, though the U.S. State Department and Mike Pompeo have stopped short of using the term genocide. Now, the U.S. says it has seen evidence, credible evidence, that is, that these 4 men, at the very least, were involved in the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. Now, others are talking about the fact that these sanctions essentially mean that these generals, as well as their family members, cannot travel to the U.S. So for many, it's not a question of the military changing its behavior simply because they can't holiday in the United States. So there would need to be much tougher sanctions and much tougher measures in place to actually get Myanmar to change its behavior towards the Rohingya people. To discuss all this a bit further, we're now joined by San Lwin, who is a campaign and media relations coordinator with the Free Rohingya Coalition. He's joining us now from Frankfurt in Germany. We're also joined by Chee, who is the president of KCL ASEAN Society in London. He's currently in Kuala Lumpur. Chee and San, thank you both for joining us. San, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of these sanctions? Do they go far enough?
First of all, as a Rohingya and Myanmar genocide survivor, we appreciate this is the recognition of the crime committed by the Myanmar military. But compared to the crime they have committed since 1978, let us talk about the 2016 and the 2017, the war situation the Rohingya people face, and more than 1 million Rohingya refugees are now in Bangladesh. But compared to all those crimes, they have, killed thousands of people, raped thousands of women, they destroyed the 400 village, and, even the small baby were thrown into the fire. So the response from the U.S. State Department is, it is completely weak compared to the crime they have committed. And also my concern is the term they have used, ethnic cleansing. It has no legal definition. So the UN fact-finding mission has described the situation as ongoing genocide and the crime against humanity. So those crimes are, punishable at the international court. So the US must recognize the term. The U.S. House of Representatives, they have the resolution, they have recognized this as the genocide. If the U.S. State Department recognizes the situation as this ongoing genocide, that will have more action. And I'm also afraid that if they stop further action against this military, they have taken action twice against this general. Now the top general, this is only barring them to travel to America. They are not going to travel to America. Maybe their immediate family, they have a lot of business in in Myanmar. So they are not going to try for the America. So we want, the serious action that can change the Rohingya situation. And also the most important for us is the protection. More than 1 million Rohingya, they need to go back to their homeland.
Okay, so Cheong, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I know that Malaysia, where you're originally based in Kuala Lumpur, it has been quite outspoken about this issue of Rohingya. Do you think that it will be satisfied with the U.S. sanctions, and what are your thoughts about them overall?
I think, first of all, thank you for having me. I think it is generally not enough for Malaysian government. Right now, our Prime Minister, Tun Dr. Mahathir, actually condemns the Myanmar leaders Aung San Suu Kyi about this issue. And we raised it in the last 34th ASEAN Summit. We raised it directly to the Myanmar government, and we talked to them about this issue. And we say that this issue must be resolved and the oppressors must be brought to justice, because this is a crime, it's a genocide, and it is definitely going against the rule and the principle of the United Nations. This must be resolved, and it is raised also by our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Saifuddin in Malaysia earlier this year. So in addition to that, Malaysia is hugely affected. We have more than 80,000 Rohingya refugees in Malaysia, and they are registered with the United Nations High Commissioners for Refugees. They have inadequate educational resources, they have a lot of problems, and they are afraid of going back to their country, afraid of being killed, afraid of being prosecuted. So these are the fears they are facing them. So Malaysian government is actually very clear on this issue that they must be brought to justice and they must be brought to the International Criminal Court.
Okay, so Nesan, I wonder, it's been said that the military needs to be targeted in a more targeted fashion, in a more specific fashion. How exactly would that happen then, Nesan? Do you think that there needs to be tougher sanctions, that there needs to be a court set up? How would that all work, considering until now the Myanmar military, the Myanmar government has essentially been allowed to do whatever it wants?
As of now, the case is at the International Criminal Court, but the case at the ICC is an element of the crime against humanity, which is the forced deportation. So there is another court, International Court of Justice, mostly known as the Wall Court. So they should be the country should be tried at the this International Court of Justice. So there are about 150 members who have rectified the ICJ, and they can sue the Myanmar government at the ICJ, but no one is ready yet. We have been hearing that Gambia is going to file the case against the Myanmar at the ICJ on behalf of the OIC country, but we have been hearing, but there is no predicate. And also from the Malaysian government, early this year we had the meeting with the Malaysian foreign minister, and they promised us something they are going to do. He has been keep talking, but we haven't got any practical action yet. And also the civilian government led by the Aung San Suu Kyi, they are also responsible for the crime the military are committing, because recently, just yesterday, the NLD spokesman, the ruling party spokesman, condemned the U.S. sanction. So the government is collaborating with the military to eliminate the Rohingya, and they have no intention to bring back the Rohingya, because they have been keep offering the national verification and whatever Rohingya do not like, and these are the things. So we need serious action, the tougher sanction or the intervention. Even we welcome any type of the intervention from any country. We just want to go back to our homeland with the dignity and the protection, because this cycle of the violence against us is repeating again and again.
Okay, so let me go to you then, Chee Yong, with that same question then. If we're talking about Aung San Suu Kyi's government specifically, do you think that many countries around the world are having a hard time coming to terms with the fact that this Nobel Peace Prize laureate has in fact sided on the side of those who have committed these atrocities? And is that part of the hesitation of why even a country such as Malaysia, for example, has not been tougher on Myanmar?
I think generally we should not quickly come to a judgment that Aung San Suu Kyi's civilian government is part of the crime, because we are not sure actually what is happening in Myanmar, whether it's the military leaders or the civilian leaders, they are committing the crime in the Rakhine states. So for Malaysia governments, the important point is to facilitate communications among ASEAN members as well as the involving country like Bangladesh. We need to talk and we need to understand what is happening in the Rakhine State. At the same time, providing whatever assistance that they need to help the Rohingya refugees to settle down in their host country first. So if they go back with fears and afraid of being prosecuted, then we should not put them back to the country, and we should actually help them first to help them settle down in maybe Malaysia. So after that, after facilitation of communications, of forums, of talks, then after that we know the root cause of the problems, then only we find the relevant and the right solution to it. I think that would be a better choice rather than quickly to come to a judgment to say that Aung San Suu Kyi is part of the crime. But nonetheless, they are not doing enough, and the Malaysian government has made it absolutely clear that they need to do more. If they want to go back to the international community, they must do more, and they must let us know what is happening in Rakhine State.
Okay, so Nathan, I wanted to get your thoughts on why do you think it is that the international community is not doing more? What is holding back everybody from going a lot tougher on Myanmar?
First of all, the problem is the geopolitics, and China is backing the Myanmar, and there are also the business investment from the different country. And the Singapore is the top country. They have invested about the 22 billion in Myanmar, and recently they have deported 6 Rakhine Buddhist activists from the Singapore, and they were arrested in Myanmar again. So they are doing this intentionally. They are helping the Myanmar military, and there are the China is the second biggest investor, and they are investing a lot. China and the Singapore are investing a lot in Rakhine State as well, and also there are many other countries. The Japan, South Korea, they have their own business interests, and also U.S. is always power balancing with the China. So we are in the middle, no one is taking our side, and Bangladesh is hosting more than 1 million. They have been asking all the country to resolve this problem. But this problem is not the recent problem. This has been happening since 1978. We have to remember that, this has been more than 40 years now. So this time, if they are talking about the repatriation, but no one is talking about the protection. The protection is very important, not to be persecuted again, and also to ensure the to restore the full citizenship. Everyone is talking about the pathway to citizenship, which is unacceptable for us because we used to be the citizen. We used to be recognized as the indigenous ethnic group, one of the ethnic group in Burma. So there are a lot of things. And, like one superpower country, if they take side with the Rohingya, I think the problem will be solved. There is another important is to bring those criminals to the justice. That is also very important.
Okay, so Chee, one of the major concerns, the Rohingya issue, is that in Rakhine State or otherwise, essentially it seems that those villages have been razed to the ground, right? And as time continues to pass, as many of these Rohingyas have fled, be it to Bangladesh or Malaysia or other places, as more time passes, is it not possible that those very villages will be rebuilt in a different shape and be populated with other people, therefore essentially not leaving any space for the Rohingya to even come back to?
I think this has been generally a long time issue. It has been the problem since 1940, since the British retreated from Myanmar actually. So in order to rebuild the land, I agree with your point that it is impossible to do it alone by the Myanmar government. It must be done with international assistance, with international support, with the assistance from international community, including Malaysian government, ASEAN government, as well as superpower like the United States and the United Kingdoms. And everyone must play a role and facilitated by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to come together and to plan a future for the Rohingya refugees. I think this is a more comprehensive plan rather than doing it alone by the Myanmar government. Everyone has a role to play and has a role to help them get back to the place where they belong and help them to settle down. It will not be very short term. It will take a long time, and I think we all need to work together toward achieving this goal.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final comment. Of course, we appreciate both of your time, your insight and analysis. That was San Lwin and Chee Yong speaking to us there about this, of course, important issue and disturbing issue. As I put to Chee Yong there, as time passes, it seems that this issue will become even tougher to resolve because with villages razed to the ground, homes burnt down and evidence being removed as we speak, what will be left for the Rohingya to come back to, really, if we're completely honest? And what's to say that tomorrow Rakhine State will not just be populated by Buddhists or others who are supportive of the Myanmar government and are not those who are Rohingya themselves? Will there even be something for the Rohingya to come back to as time passes? And how much longer can the international community then sit on its hands and allow for this situation to continue? The U.S. sanctions, everyone can argue, are not enough. This just seems like a save face move on the part of the U.S. so that others cannot then point fingers at it and say it didn't do anything in the face of these atrocities. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on how that situation develops. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Thanks for staying with us, viewers, here in Scope. Now, a disturbing report has come out by the United Nations that after nearly a decade of progress in this regard, the number of people who now suffer from hunger has in fact increased over the past 3 years. Now, this disturbing trend also talks about the fact that malnutrition has gone up. So it's not just looking at hunger. That's one, of course, important indicator of all of the above, but there's also then the argument about malnutrition. Because at the same time as hunger and malnutrition have gone up, obesity has also gone up. How does one then make sense of all of this? And of course, unfortunately, it seems that Africa has been the one that has continued to suffer the most from hunger-related issues throughout these years. And that's, of course, an important focus. And we're going to try to focus on that in this discussion as well here in Scope. To speak about that, we're now joined by Adesewa Josh, who is an international journalist. Her work spans nearly a decade on issues bordering on Africa's growth and development, politics, and diplomatic affairs. She's joining us now from Istanbul. We're also joined by Mercy Abang, who is an award-winning journalist, and she talks, of course, at length about vulnerable communities in her work. She's joining us now from Abuja in Nigeria. And we're also joined by Priscilla Nwikpo, who is a political analyst, and she is joining us now from the British capital, London. Priscilla, Mercy, and Adesewa, thank you all three for joining us. Adesewa, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of this report? Where has the world gone wrong, do you think, in dealing with these issues, not just in the context of Africa, but globally?
Thank you so much for having me on the program. You yourself and the UN, you're very correct about the fact leading to the point where we are in terms of the report about hunger and obesity and malnutrition. Climate change and war, these are the two driving factors, and we cannot underplay them. But I would like to quickly come down to the war aspect of it and then narrow it down to Africa, because that's where my major area of expertise is, and I've traveled widely, and I can tell you categorically and factually some of the points I'm about to make is what's going on the ground. So, climate change in terms of Africa, the effect is precarious, and the effect actually differs from what you see in the rest of the world. But in terms of war, one will argue that Africa hasn't had that much wars in the last couple of years, in the last decade. But what you would see is that even though there is the absence of war, political violence is on the rise. Yeah. And conflict data shows that political violence was on a sporadic rise between 2010 and 2015 in countries like Egypt, Somalia, Nigeria, DRC, and these countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, which has the largest population in the whole of Africa. And some of these countries also have the highest population. So when you think of those conflicts and how it is driving internally displaced people, how it is driving that number up, you would then understand why we are at this point now. And also statistics shows that 80% of world's displaced people are in Africa. So now we need to do the math.
Indeed.
So yes, there are no wars, but
Indeed. I wanted to go to Mercy then. Mercy, what are your thoughts on this? Because, as I'd put in my introduction, for many people on the face of it, at least, Mercy, when you're looking at these numbers and these statistics, it would not make sense that obesity is going up at the same time that hunger and malnutrition are going up. How do you contextualize that?
Obesity is going up for the Western nations, if I may say that, for those that have it well to do for. But obesity is not going up for Africans or for people or persons in the third world countries. For instance, let's look at the Lake Chad region, where there's Chad, there's Nigeria, there's Niger. There's depleting water from that end. There's Boko Haram rising from that end, increasing the number of displaced persons. There's herdsmen conflict. When you look at Boko Haram crisis, the terrorist insurgency across West Africa, and you look at the clashes between farmers and Fulani headsmen, for instance, it now hits you why the hunger crisis is for real. Because farmers can no longer farm because they are now having constant clash with the farmers and the resident communities where the cattle are supposed to herd. So, in essence, when you talk about obesity, I don't think it's an issue where someone from Chad or someone from northern Nigeria is going to be concerned about. Someone from northern Nigeria is concerned about malnutrition because we have millions and millions of people, children, women, that have been displaced as a result of Boko Haram insurgency. And these are communities that were predominantly farming communities. But as a result of the conflict, people can no longer farm. Rather, people are looking for safety. People are running from one point to another. And we've seen in cases where people in communities run from one community to another and they run into another clash. People run from Nigeria, from a certain part of Nigeria to a certain part of Cameroon, and they keep running and running. So when people keep running, they're concerned about safety, they're concerned about what they're going to eat, and at that point, they're no longer farming. And most communities, especially a community like the Nigerian society, we largely depend on subsistent farmers. Let's be realistic. We don't have large-scale farming sectors that feed the nation for the Nigerian as a country. So we depend on subsistent farmers. When subsistent farmers are no longer safe enough to farm for the millions of Nigerians, what does that tell you? It clearly tells you that the hunger crisis is just about to begin.
Okay, so Priscilla, I want to get your thoughts because, Priscilla, as the UN had put out, in fact, it had a goal that by 2030 it was going to zero hunger around the world. And obviously, clearly, that is not going to happen now, according to the numbers that we are seeing. Where has everything gone wrong? Do you think that, as I'd put to Mercy as well, when you look at the numbers, we're talking about malnutrition and hunger on one side and obesity on the other. Do you think that we're looking at this in too large a scale, that Africa itself should be leading the solutions to Africa's problems with hunger and malnutrition?
There's absolutely no doubt. Thank you for having me. There's absolutely no doubt that Africa should be leading with solutions for Africa's problems. However, I think, when we're talking about this increase that we now see, it's not just a case of what is happening in Africa, but it's also a case of what is happening around the world. The United Kingdom, for instance, it's the 5th largest economy. But within this report, we're also told that this 5th largest economy in the world has 14.2 million people who are also living below poverty line. Now, when we look at those statistics and we ask the question, how did we arrive here? We've arrived here in the UK because of government cuts, because of, the investment that government has put into, programs that will sustain those who are below the food chain within the society. It's the same thing in Africa. African governments are not investing. For instance, we've heard the situation in Nigeria we have a lot of internally displaced people. But the question is this, and we also have the level of insecurity that's been mentioned. Yeah. The question is, what is the government doing in those regards to, first of all, ensure that there is security, and also ensure that these subsistent farmers that sustain, the food sufficiency for the country are safe and able to continue to farm. You will find that most of these governments are somewhat lacking in their policies and in ensuring the safety of their people. So I think it's also a case of political will. It's a case of policies, and it's a case of, the choices that governments are making around the world. The only region at the moment that has, perhaps a slight increase, if you like, it's the Latin American and the Caribbean region. But outside of that, the rest of the world have had an increase. We're now at 800 million people.
Yeah.
Billion people. What are the governments doing about it? What are the UN doing about it? Yes, it's part of the Sustainable Development Goals, but
Indeed.
are we now putting the right kind of pressure on governments?
Okay, and that's a very good point, because I want to put that to Adesewa. Is this an issue of poor governance?
Okay, so I am going to address this question from the realities of day-to-day living. The truth is that population is on the rise, okay? And it's not just in Africa, it's in Asia. There's population explosion. And population explosion also comes with urbanization. And when there is both, land decreases. And in a place like Africa, where we depend on subsistence farming, where our processes are still very primitive, it means that if we have cases like, political violence and we have displacement, it means people don't have access to their lands anymore. They don't just have access to their lands because of urbanization, they also don't have access to it because of violence. And so government needs to narrow down what the problem is, which is we are creating problem by being a quote unquote silly and making people fight our battles for us, number one. And then we are also not putting into context how we are growing. Urbanization is a good thing, but we need to figure it out. Now, I know that I am not a huge fan of genetically modified farming, but countries around the world that have been stuck with explosive population have had to come around technologies that help them to produce food for their growing population. So yes, we need the government to become as creative as possible and address it as of now. Sometimes you have to create your own answers. The answers are not in books that have been written before. We may need to get creative and address the problems. Yes, urbanization is happening. Population increase is there, and we don't have land. We are losing land. So what can we do? Let's get in the labs and create the food. If we have the normal procedures that helps to mitigate the other effect of genetically modified farming, which is where I think obesity comes in, because you begin to have these products that are not well grown in the lab. You're producing egg and chicken in 3 days. That's absurd. You get me? But if we have procedures that protect these new processes, these new technologies that we have, we can feed our people without thinking of the other side of GMO farming.
Okay, so Mercy, what are your thoughts on governance and how governments around Africa have been dealing with this situation? Because, not too long ago, we had that huge issue in Cape Town in South Africa as well about water. Do you think that the African Union, for example, should be leading this for Africa? Who exactly in Africa is in a position of influence when it comes to this issue?
Absolutely. I do agree that the African Union should be on the front lines on the conversation around food security, for its people. Having said that, we've seen an African Union over the years that, I have my reservation about how far they've gone. But I feel like when we talk about the depleting Lake Chad crisis, it's a world problem. We should see it that way. And that's where I have to drag the UN and get them involved at some point. As I speak with you, Boko Haram is still having a stronger hold along the Lake Chad region as I speak. As a matter of fact, that's their biggest control. That area has become the epicenter of Boko Haram, from the Lake Chad axis to Niger to Nigeria. And why is the world watching while all of this is going on? Clearly, Nigerian government cannot contend with Boko Haram alone. As we've seen so far, the crisis that Nigeria is dealing with at the moment is overwhelming. There are internal security issues, there are headers issues, there are lots and lots of issues. So Boko Haram on its own, they're still holding sway to lots of communities along that axis. If we need to be able to have that Lake Chad region back in shape as it were 20, 30 years ago, so that we can have these farmers move back to start farming, the fishermen to take control of some of this, because you can't even farm without water. Let's be realistic about it. And for these communities, they need water to be able to farm. They need water to be able to keep up. So if we need subsistence farmers to be able to feed the rest of us, so I feel like the world should no longer look at it as, oh, well, it's a Nigerian problem. No, it's not a Nigerian problem. The Lake Chad problem is a world problem. And if we keep seeing it that way, it makes the world a better place. If we keep calling it a Nigerian problem, then we're clearly saying then Nigerians should sort it out. Then millions of young people in Nigeria will keep getting through the Atlantic Ocean, through the desert, just to flee, just to get better jobs, just to be able to feed, while the depleted axis of that region is taken over by terrorists that will gradually get into the various urban areas, and if we're not careful, throw a bomb and kill the rest of us. So first and foremost, I think the African Union needs to be on the front lines. I mean, it's like you being a father of the house and you need help. You need to show leadership, clearly. I mean, I wouldn't put it on the UN alone, but I feel like the AU needs to show leadership and call on agencies, the European Union, because that axis is also closer to the EU, to come and help, because we really do need help. And
okay, we'll leave there as a final word, Mercy. I do apologize for cutting you off. That's gotten the best of us, but we do sincerely appreciate all three of your time, your insight and analysis. That was Mercy, Priscilla, and Adesewa, who were speaking to us there and sharing their thoughts with us and their expertise, of course, on this very important topic. Because as Mercy there said at the end, it's not just about Africa, of course, even though the most disturbing numbers are coming out of Africa, as they have genuinely for many, many years. But it's in fact a world problem, and one cannot just see, for example, as Mercy had put it very well, Lake Chad's issue as just an African issue. It genuinely is a global issue, and this affects everybody. Priscilla obviously also contextualized the situation in the UK, and yes, hunger, malnutrition are going up in the UK in drastic numbers if you actually look at them over the past number of years. Where are all of these governments going wrong in their policies, and why isn't the alarm bell ringing loud enough around the world about this issue? Climate change, war, has created chaos around the world, and so has overpopulation in some places around the world. These are very sensitive issues, but important issues that need to be discussed out in the open. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. But I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.